today's virtual lecture co-hosted by College Year in Athens and the Princeton Club of Greece. I am Theonis Kourta, the Academic Vice President, and on behalf of our institution's President, Mr. Alexis Philaktopoulos, who is also the President of the Princeton Club of Greece, I want to thank you all for virtually joining us today. It is truly a privilege and an honor to be introducing today's guest speaker and the discussant, both of whom have a significant academic standing when it comes to philosophy and the study of fundamental questions such as those about reason, faith, religion, epistemology, and ethics. Our guest speaker, Professor Douglas Hedley, is the preeminent scholar in the field of the philosophy of religion, the director of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, and a professor of the philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, aspects of romantic and idealistic thought, and philosophy of religion. Our discussant, Professor Stelios Virvidakis, a Princeton alumnus, taught at CYA in the 90s and is now Professor of Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and History of Science of the University of Athens. His current research interests include issues in epistemology, metaphilosophy, metaethics, the history of modern philosophy, and the philosophy of literature. Now, the backstory of how today's lecture came to be. It is through an alumnus of ours, Daniel Tolan, class of spring 2012, that we were introduced to Professor Douglas Hedley. It seems that a seed was planted here at our school, and as Daniel then furthered his education at Cambridge, he connected with Professor Hedley, and their mutual love for Greece got them talking about CYA. Professor Hedley, aside from presenting for us today, he is at CYA this week, offering a 2-day seminar to our students, including a few students from the Athens University, on the seriousness of play. The seminar began yesterday and will end tomorrow, and he is also here to discuss a possible future collaboration between CYA and the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism. Professor Hedley, we want to thank you, truly thank you, for accepting our invitation, getting to know the school and the members of our academic community, and of course for inspiring our students. We thank you both, Professor Hedley and Professor Virvidakis, for accepting our invitation to participate in this virtual lecture co-hosted by CYA and the Princeton Club of Greece. It is a privilege to have both of you here today. Professor Virvidakis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Theoni. Let me also begin by thanking CYA for this invitation and say that I'm very happy to be back and working with you again. And also it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk with Professor Hedley and listen to his talk, and then also have a chance to engage in discussion with him. But also I should say that I'm looking forward to learning a lot of things about the Cambridge Platonists, and concerning whom he is a specialist. And I know him from his work, but now I have a chance to meet him. So let me say that Professor Hedley will talk for about 45 or 50 minutes. Then I will ask a couple of questions, some basic questions, and then we will have a discussion with everyone attending the webinar. So Professor Hedley, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Virvidakis. It's a great honor to be invited to speak to CYA. And if I could just start by offering my thanks for the very warm and cordial welcome that I've enjoyed at CYA. So thank you very much to the college for that. I think also that my talk this evening is linked to the significance of the Hellenic tradition in Western Europe in the early modern period. So in that sense, given the momentous legacy of Athens and Greek culture for Western civilization, I hope that the topic is appropriate in that sense. So between Pascal and Baruch Spinoza, faith, reason, and the Cambridge Platonists. Spinoza's theological political treatise and Pascal's Pensées were published in 1670. Pascal, 1623 to 1662, and Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, were both thinkers in an intellectual milieu shaped by Descartes, 1596 to 1650. They were both deeply influenced by Descartes and yet critical of the Frenchman's philosophy. In fact, one could view both Spinoza and Pascal as radicalizing certain aspects of Cartesianism. They are both philosophers who are articulating a vision of reality in a distinctively modern context. Even though Pascal might be viewed as an anti-modern. Recently, Antoine Compagnon has defined Pascal as l'anti-moderne même. That's in a book entitled Les Antimodernes de Joseph de Maistre à Roland Barthes, published in 2005. But in this sense, you could say it's precisely because of Pascal's heightened awareness of the power of the scientific perspective in the modern world and the challenge that it poses to conventional theistic belief that is significant here. Commentators, moreover, such as Jovel, see Spinoza, on the other hand, as a harbinger of secular Judaism, and famously Jonathan Israel sees Spinoza as the key to radical enlightenment in the modern period. So let me just start off with a classic quotation from Pascal. And this is the first quotation. The year of grace 1654, Monday, the 23rd of November, from about 10:30 in the evening until about 10:30, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of philosophers and scholars. Certainty, joy, certainty, emotion, sight, joy, God of Jesus Christ. Deum meum et Deum veto. Your God will be my God. Ruth, oblivious to the world and to everything except God. He can only be found in the ways taught by the gospel, greatness of the human soul. Pascal, the memorial. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of philosophers and scholars. This is the articulation of faith in the wake of his mystical experience on the night, 3rd of November, 1654. Prima facie, it's a critique of rational speculation and natural or philosophical theology. By way of contrast, Spinoza's metaphysics of the relation between human and divine could hardly be more different. In his theological political tractate and his ethics, Spinoza replaces a religion founded on revelation, tradition, and ritual with philosophy conceived of in the most stringent, rationalistic manner. Pascal is widely known for his claim that c'est le cœur qui sent Dieu et non la raison. Voilà ce que c'est que la foi. Dieu sensible au cœur et non à la raison. In contrast to Pascal's defense of the affective dimension of belief, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas, the full title of Spinoza's ethics is demonstrated in a geometrical manner. And consequently, we find axioms, definitions, postulates, propositions, corollaries. God and the world, virtue and vice, freedom and bondage form for Spinoza a structure that can be understood as composed of necessary truths open to rational insight. Modern physics, the Galilean Cartesian model, presents the natural world as the quantitative realm of moving items subject to mathematical laws. And the new science inaugurated a particularly radical severance between spirit and matter. Descartes was forced to re-envisage the relation between the physical realm and the mind with a dualism between the res cogitans and the domain of res extensa. The philosophical response of Spinoza is that of a mechanistic monism in which the plurality of substances in Descartes, including the supreme divine substance, is integrated into a substance monism, in which all events in the universe are causally determined, and both chance and free will are rejected. The intuition of freedom is grounded upon the ignorance of real causes. The appeal to the will of God as a mode of explanation is the asylum of ignorance. Spinoza explicitly denies the primacy of the spiritual over the material. Physical and the mental are two attributes of the same substance. Nor is there any causal influence between the two, but a parallelism between them. I shall treat of the nature and strength of the emotions and the mind's power over them by the same method I have used in treating of God and the mind, and I shall consider human actions and appetites just as if it were an investigation into lines, planes, or bodies. So the Ethics, Book 3 in the preface. With Pascal, we find there's also a stark confrontation of the new science. This is hardly surprising for one of the outstanding mathematicians and scientists of the age. Yet Pascal's stance is quite distinct from Spinoza, whose thought he could not have known. Pascal's appeal is to the paradoxical presence of a God who hides himself. Pascal's God is only really revealed in the heart of mankind and through grace. God is also revealed in the misery of the unbeliever. For Spinoza, there is no moral universe as such. For him, there is not a God who is the arbiter of good and evil. Good is defined as that which is useful for human beings, and bad as that which presents obstacles. The fourth book of the Ethics states that good and evil are not intrinsic to the universe, but projected by frail human beings. So, the trenchant critique of the anthropomorphism in the appendix of Book 1 of the Ethics prepares the ground for what might call a neo-Stoic pantheism of Spinoza's philosophy, optimistic on the surface, but pessimistic at heart. There is, for the Dutch sage, no gap between the is and the ought. Spinoza is finding consolation in a bleak, even desolate vision of reality. So I don't find it surprising that Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, the late 18th century, viewed Spinoza as the great source of modern nihilism. Nor is it puzzling that Nietzsche came to view Spinoza as a predecessor of his own thought. Here's a rather remarkable quote from Nietzsche. I am utterly amazed, utterly entranced. I have a precursor, and what precursor? I hardly knew Spinoza. That I should have turned to him just now was inspired by him. Not only is his overt tendency like mine, namely to take all knowledge most powerful affect, but in 5 main points of his doctrine, I recognize myself. This most unusual and loneliest thinker is closest to me precisely in these matters. He denies the freedom of the will, teleology, the moral world order, the unegoistic and evil. Even though the divergences are admittedly tremendous, they are due more to the difference in time, culture, and science. In summa, my lonesomeness, which, as on very high mountains, often made it hard for me to breathe and make my blood rush out, is now at least a twosomeness. That's a letter from Nietzsche to Overbeck on the 30th of July, 1881. I'm now coming to the topic of mystery. Pascal pondered upon mysteries, rather as the 20th century French philosopher Gabriel Marcel was wont much later to distinguish between problems and mysteries. Pascal was far from presenting religious faith as a crude wager with which he is frequently associated. There is a philosophical, theological dimension to his apologetic that draws upon a critique of jejune rationalism. It may seem jarring that the expert geometer says contradiction is not an indication of falsehood, but an absence of contradiction is not a sign of truth. This is from the Pensée 208 and is perhaps rather reminiscent of the great late medieval thinker Nicholas of Cusa. Pascal quotes the Hermetic Platonic notion of the sphere whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is everywhere. This image of the infinite sphere whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is ubiquitous, is normally applied to God. Here, rather intriguingly, it's applied to nature. The theme of the infinite is salient for Pascal's account of the mystery of humanity. I see only infinity on every side, hemming me in like an atom, or like the shadow of a fleeting instance. Qu'est-ce qu'un homme dans l'infini? What is man in the infinite, he asks. What is man in nature? A nothing compared to the infinite, a whole compared to the nothing, a middle point between all and nothing, infinitely remote from an understanding of the extremes. This question posed in Pascal's 230th Pensée is central. How can finite mankind relate to an infinite God? One might note parallels with the proposition of Nicholas's infiniti ad finitum proportionem non esse. There's no proportion between the finite and the infinite. Pascal shares with Cusa a learned ignorance that recognizes the radical gulf between creator and created, while claiming that this can be maintained through an access to Christ. This is perhaps an Augustinian dimension, moreover, Pascal's thought. The God who is ubique totus et nusquam locorum, who dwells in the depths, interior intimo meo summum meo, Confessions 3, 6, 11. This is the God, according to Augustine, is more inward than my inward self, and yet higher than the highest. For Spinoza, by contrast, genuine mystery is an oxymoron. The appeal to mystery for Spinoza simply hides ignorance. Indeed, he says, the human mind has an adequate knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God. Hence, we see that God's infinite essence and his eternity are known to all. So Ethics 2:7. Now, a good example of the contrast in temperament and philosophical approach between these two thinkers can be seen in relation to the problem of miracles. The notion of miracles could be seen as the litmus test of attitudes of philosophers in the Enlightenment and to the whole question of enlightenment. Pascal regards belief in miracles as pivotal for the religious life. Where is your God, he says. Miracles reveal him and are a flash of light. Miracles play an important role in Pascal's pensée and are linked in his mind to mystery and paradox. For Spinoza, by contrast, miracles are per definitionem impossible. There are only law-like events that the ignorant misunderstand. For nature is always the same, and its force or power of acting is everywhere one and the same. That's from Ethics 3 preface. This is a characteristic statement of Spinoza's decisive, one might even say rampant naturalism. Human behavior has to be understood in terms of the same laws that cover the behavior of material objects and events. There is no distinction between reasons and causes. The self. Spinoza's philosophy has radical implications for his view of the self. Spinoza implicitly rejects the Cartesian standpoint, the I think. Rather than the immaterial Cartesian res cogitans, the thinking thing, the self is a modification of the twin attributes of extension and thought. The challenge to ethics for Spinoza is not so much egoism as ignorance of the nature of the self in relation to the rest of nature. For Pascal, the rational thinking thing of Descartes is replaced by a fragmented and conflicted composite of orders. The heart, reason, and will are rather distinct, and this conflicted nature constitutes part of the grandeur and misery of humanity. So notice a couple of these quotations from Pascal. Let us see ourselves as lost within this forgotten outpost of nature, and let us from within this little prison cell where we find ourselves, by which I mean the universe, learn to put a correct value on the earth, its kingdoms, its cities, and ourselves. We are something, we are not everything. What we have of being hides from us the knowledge of the first principles which emerge from nothingness. The scant being that we have hides from us the sight of infinity. For Spinoza, by contrast, we are part of Deus sive natura, God, or call it nature. And sinful imperfection is not a topic that Spinoza can tolerate. Indeed, he's scathing about any confession of unworthiness, guilt, or remorse as a mere reduction of power. As for Pascal, of course, sin is key to his anthropology. Without this most incomprehensible of all mysteries, Pascal says, we are incomprehensible to ourselves. Within this gnarled chasm lie the twists and turns of our condition. So humanity is more inconceivable without this mystery than this mystery is conceivable to humanity. So on the question of faith, Pascal says famously in the Pensée 680, it's the heart that feels God, not reason. That is what faith is. Pascal's Pensées are devoted to persuasion. He is rhetorically both beautiful and brilliant. As for Spinoza, truth is a matter of philosophical demonstration. And this is quite unrelated to persuasion or choice. For Pascal, the expert geometer, this is to confuse l'esprit de géométrie with l'esprit de finesse. L'esprit de finesse is the intuitive mind with depth and penetration. The other, the geometric, has what Pascal calls breadth. Each of these, he claims, can exist without the other. And this is presumably his meaning when he introduces paradoxical claim. Se moquer de la philosophie, c'est vraiment philosophique. It's not to mock the philosopher per se, when he says to mock the philosophy is to truly philosophize. He's not mocking philosophy per se, but he's trying to critique a limited conception of the subject. And in his appeal to experience, evidently a personal appeal in this case, Pascal is not without precedent within the Platonic tradition. Indeed, Plotinus, perhaps the paradigmatic mystical philosopher of antiquity, can say in Ennead 6, 9, 9, 47 to 8, 48, he who has seen it knows what I mean. Okay, so now having discussed Pascal and Spinoza, I'm going to turn to the Cambridge Platonists. And I'm going to entitle this section The Augustinian, the Alexandrian, and the Enlightenment Paradigms. So having argued for the opposition of Pascal and Spinoza as representatives of two distinct approaches to the question of religious belief in the wake of the new science, I wish to turn to the Cambridge Platonists. This is a school of philosophers and theologians who lived and worked largely in Cambridge University in the mid part of the 17th century. They constitute the most important Platonic school in Europe between the Italian Renaissance and the Romantic Age. One might describe them as the first modern Platonists. They accept modern science, and indeed they are staunch advocates of tolerance. Who were they? The German historian Johann Jakob Brücker, writing in the 1730s and 1740s, describes the Cambridge Platonists as constituting an Alexandrian form of Platonism. This is from his Kurze Fragen aus der philosophischen Historie of 1735. And this, I think, by Brücker's nomenclature, is a useful way of describing the figures I'm discussing. Their Platonism is eclectic in the mode characteristic of the Alexandrian school, and religious, in this case, Christian. Plotinus and Origen are the most notable sources for their thought, though one can also trace sources for their philosophy in medieval, particularly in German, in the school of Eckhart, and the Renaissance, and especially Ficino and Erasmus. The leading figure of the group was Benjamin Whichcote, 1609 to 1683, a notable preacher, the dominant Cambridge divine, who, however, was not particularly devoted to writing or research. His writings, in fact, appeared posthumously. The key writers are Henry More, 1614 to 1687, and Ralph Hudworth, 1617 to 1688. So I'll just see if I can give you a photo of a couple of those figures. So here's Henry More for you, and here's Hudworth. One of the other figures I will mention is John Smith, 1618 to 1652. Now, their Alexandrian temper of thought might be characterized as a rejection of both the strong Augustinianism of the Calvinist party in the Church of England at the time, with its stress on double predestination and the inscrutable nature of the deity. In fact, one might begin with the notion of belief as an act of will, which has been profoundly influential in the last couple of centuries, particularly in Protestant thought, from Kierkegaard through to William James. But this is often linked with a current of anti-intellectualism. The Cambridge Platonists are averse to any such anti-intellectualism. Perhaps the most significant early statement of this is Whichcote's critique of his colleague Tuckney's Calvinist view of man's depravity. Whichcote was master of King's College and the vice-chancellor of the university at the time of this exchange in 1650. The estimation of reason is expressed by Whichcote when he says to Tuckney, "I oppose not rational to spiritual, for spiritual is most rational." Or when he says, "Reason is the divine governor of man's life. It is the very voice of God." That's from his aphorism 76. In opposition to the high Calvinism of Tuckney, member of the Westminster Confession, Whichcote is expressing a Christian humanism that extends through Erasmus back to the Alexandrian fathers. But we should not confuse it with any form of narrow rationalism. This is particularly evident when John Smith is expounding what he calls the true way or method of attaining to divine knowledge. But yet, all that knowledge which is separated from an inward acquaintance with virtue and goodness is of a far different nature than that which writes about the true living sense of them, which is the best discerner thereof, and by which alone we know the true perfection, sweetness, energy, and loveliness of them, and all that which is ute reton ute grappum, that which can no more be known by a naked demonstration than colors can be perceived of a blind man by any definition or description which he can hear of them. So here we have a rather remarkable notion of knowledge by direct acquaintance rather than, as he says, definition or description. Smith, who can tell the delights of these mysterious converses with the deity when he says reason is turned into sense and faith becomes vision. This is, he says, nothing but an infant Christ formed in the soul. This is the reference to the Eckhart school that I mentioned we find in the German theology, a text that Henry Moore described as a golden treatise. Now, the Cambridge Platonists accept the new science and produce an interweaving of Platonism and Cartesianism. That's actually from Henry Moore himself. On this model, motion and what he calls discernible or visible extension form the basis of lifeless bodies. The Platonists have banished substantial forms, intentional species of the self-originating motion of the late scholastic world. They accept the primary-secondary quality distinction. However, primary qualities cannot explain consciousness. Cudworth writes, the atomical hypothesis, allowing to body but what is either included in the idea of a thing impenetrably extended, or can be clearly conceived to be a mode of it, as more or less magnitude, visibility, figure, sight, motion, and rest, together with the results of their several combinations, cannot possibly make life and cogitation be qualities of body. So, in his claim that a mechanistic account of science cannot explain the emergence of consciousness, he is saying that this is on the basis of the Neoplatonic principle of the hierarchy of being and the related tenet that the effect must be inferior to the cause. He says it is utterly impossible that greater perfection and higher degrees of being could rise and ascend out of lesser and lower, so as that which is most absolutely imperfect of all things should be the first fountain of all. Nor can knowledge be limited to sensation. All of these figures, Cudworth, Moore, Whichcote, Smith, hold to eternal verities, which include abstract objects, moral and aesthetic values. There is an order of value, a scale of perfection, derived from the idea of the good, and the temporal seen world veiling an unseen eternal realm of absolute values. The Alexandrian notion of the divine logos as the principle of the physical and the visible cosmos, and the divine word as the key to the function of the finite mind, means that there is no radical antithesis between nature and the supernatural. So they could say, with John Scott Eriugena, the great 9th century Platonist who was edited in Cambridge in the 17th century, in the milieu of the Cambridge Platonists, every visible and invisible creature is a theophany. And for our thinkers, the via negativa, the negative way, is largely absent. For them, the physical world is the glass of the divine. There can be no ultimate conflict of science and religion. John Smith says that God made the universe and all the creatures contained therein are so many glasses wherein he might reflect his own glory. He hath copied forth himself in creation. However, the soul as a mirror of the divine needs to be kept polished. Rather than the translucent immediacy of the Cartesian res cogitans, Cudworth's account of the self is an intriguing mixture of themes from Plotinus and Origen. Plotinus's idea of different levels of the soul, and a teleological ethical sense of the self as a striving towards the supreme principle, tohen, is linked to Origen's ruling principle, or hegemonikon. Cudworth presents the inward sense of the self as revealing what he calls a hegemonical principle, which, comprehending all other powers, energies, and capacities of our souls, which determines the direction of the soul, either for better or worse. We are, for Cudworth, what we aspire to. And as I've mentioned earlier, this hegemonikon, taken from Origen, and indeed in Origen himself and Cudworth, is identified with an indwelling mystical Christ of St. John, all. So I conclude here with a passage from Cudworth, where he's talking about the inward principle. This is the new law of the gospel. It is a kind of musical soul informing the dead organ of our hearts that makes them of their own accord delight to act harmoniously according to the rule of God's word. The law that I speak of, it is a law of love. It is the most powerful law in the world, yet it freeth us in a manner from all love with us, because it maketh us become a law unto ourselves. Of course, this philosophy of self is linked to a theology of deification, uniting God and the soul together in the highest powers of the soul by, quote, a living and quickening spirit of true religion, there uniting God and soul together in the unity of affections, will, and end. That's from Smith's Select Discourses, page 418. Love for these philosophers reveals the mystery of life. Cudworth could share that claim with Pascal. But the Alexandrian, as opposed to the Augustinian side of Cudworth, emerges when he says, there is a nature of goodness and a nature of wisdom antecedent to the will of God, which is the rule and measure of it. So Cudworth could agree with the sentiment of the Victorian agnostic John Stuart Mill, who said, I will call no being good who is not what I mean when I apply that epithet to my fellow creatures. And if such a being can sentence me to hell for not so calling him, to hell I will go. That's from John Stuart Mill's examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy. But Cudworth would agree. And of course, this insistence upon the univocity of divine and human goodness generates severe problems for Cudworth's theodicy. And indeed, in general, sin is not emphasized in the theology of the Cambridge Platonists. They don't deny the tenet, but nor do they foreground the notion in the manner of the Jansenist Augustinian Pascal. Indeed, we can find phrases in Whichcote such as, the good nature of the heathen is more godlike than the furious zeal of a Christian. Indeed, on miracles, the Platonists, like the Alexandrians, often allegorize to uncover a more profound spiritual meaning, but they do not, like the deists or Spinoza, express disbelief in miracles, and Cudworth critiques what he calls the high-flown spiritualists who effectively deny the historical life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So, can we situate the Cambridge Platonists between the fideism and the extreme rationalism of Pascal and Spinoza, respectively? The Cambridge Platonists are sometimes presented as a charming revival or an obscure recrudescence of Renaissance Platonism. Yet their Platonism was shared by many of their contemporaries. The Cambridge Platonists, Spinoza and Pascal, all bear the legacy of Neoplatonism in some respect. Spinoza, influenced by Leone Ebrio, 1460 to 1521, uses explicitly Neoplatonic terminology. Speaks of natura naturans, natura naturata, nature naturing, nature nature. Or when he talks of the amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. Here one might think of the nous eron, the loving nous in Plotinus, or indeed Ficino's commentary on Plato's Symposium. And Pascal, as we've seen, has aspects of his thought that evince a remarkable affinity to the Christian Platonism of St. Augustine and Nicholas of Cusa. So it's not just their Platonism, as it were. It's in their views of religion, rather than their dependence on Platonic thought, that I presented to you in comparison with the Cambridge Platonists. Let me say quite clearly that the Pascalian and the Spinozistic positions are, I think, more consistent. Either the resolute anti-modernism of Pascal, with the full-blown stress on the fall, sin, and paradoxical absence and presence of the divine, or the Spinozistic rational embrace of Deus sive natura, God, or let's call it nature. The Cambridge Platonists lack, one might say, the consistency of either. Indeed, in their own age, the Cambridge Platonists were attacked by their contemporaries. They were given a nickname. They were called the men of latitude, the latitudinarians. They were accused of being figures who failed to take a coherent stand on the status of religion in the modern age. And their moderation was subjected to scorn. The great poet Dryden, for example, mocked Cudworth for offering more support to the atheist than he ever intended by considering at length the arguments of the atheists. And prominent Puritans, from Tuckney, whom I've mentioned, John Bunyan, were alarmed by this tolerance and breadth of opinion, the latitude of these thinkers. Yet if one considers the reception of the Cambridge Platonists, it was in England among the so-called broad church of the 19th century, figures like F.D. Morris, Charles Kingsley, Thomas Arnold, especially among the adherents of Coleridge more generally. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote of Henry More's theological works that they contain more original, enlarged, and elevating views of the Christian dispensation than I have met with in any other single volume. It is this enlarged and elevating view which I have called the Alexandrian, which of course drew from the German medieval mystical tradition and the Florentine tradition back to Neoplatonism and the Attic Moses himself, Plato. And the philosophy of the Cambridge Platonists does perhaps lack the radical consistency of either Pascal or Spinoza, but the consistency of those positions comes at a cost. If the thought of the ancient Platonists of Cambridge University hovered between rationalism and the spirit of tolerance of the Dutch sage, and on the other hand, the spiritual fervor and psychological penetration of the French mathematician, such an enlarged and elevating vision of the goodness of reason and the transformative power of the spirit has an abiding relevance in our own age. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. I mean, this was fascinating, and especially for those of us who are not acquainted with the work of the Platonists. I mean, I was personally, I had read very little about them rather than their works. So before we open the discussion and ask the audience to come in and ask their questions, I would like to just ask you some questions by way of clarifying, certain points. And I mean, most of this is due to my ignorance of the text. Now, first of all, I would like to just challenge a little bit your reading of Spinoza. I mean, you present him as a rampant naturalist, and okay, rampant he was, radical he was, but he was no reductionist. I mean, the parallelism view or the double aspect view or whatever, he was not like the French materialists of the 18th century, and he was not, I mean, in my opinion, according to my reading, I mean, he was less of a die-hard naturalist than Hume, although despite the fact that Hume was kind of a nice kind of person who was softer in some ways, but he lacked what I think is a religious temperament, which you find in Spinoza in some ways. Mm-hmm. Also, regarding this idea that Spinoza, what he says actually, that we have adequate knowledge of the infinite essence of God, which you quoted. Despite this, I mean, we should remember that the third degree of knowledge is very hard to attain, and that we also lack knowledge of other attributes of God. We have thought in essence, but I mean, there are infinite attributes that we cannot grasp. So in a way, he was no naive rationalist anyway, and his materialism is somehow balanced, or if you like, is complemented by this bizarre religiosity, which many people actually have noted, and that despite the fact that, okay, Nietzsche said what he said, and Jacobi and others, and atheists, consider him as a champion and as a model of atheism and materialism. And actually in the 20th century, as you know, he is, loved by many materialists. But despite all this, I mean, there is another side to him. Okay, that is a matter of interpreting Spinoza, and it would go on and on. Now, concerning Pascal, I don't want to challenge what you said. There is this fideism which is there, although it's not the same as Kierkegaard's fideism. Yeah. And after all, Pascal was also a scientist, as you pointed out, and he knew the way, the scientific way, and mathematics, and he had contributed to all this. Now, to come to the Platonists. First of all, I would like to ask you a little more. I would like to know a little more about the texts, their texts, and the writings. I mean, have they just produced treatises and texts which are not really consistent or large treatises dealing with big questions of epistemology and metaphysics? Because the authors we were discussing, I mean, okay, Pascal was a peculiar case, but definitely Spinoza was very systematic. And I've been wondering whether some of the difficulties we have with the consistency of the texts of the works, the thought of the Cambridge Platonists may be due, whether this may be due to the kind of text they produced. And I would like to know a little more about exactly what is the corpus we are dealing with. You just mentioned, they said this or that, but where do these texts come from? And then to get into the substance of their work, it's obvious that they embrace some kind of value realism, which goes back to Plato. Yeah. But there is also the Neoplatonic kind of reading, which gives us a monistic view, a view of continuity, if you like, which, as you said, may be common to also all three of them. I mean, there is a kind of influence going back to Plotinus, also in Spinoza, with natura naturans and naturata. So that may be what is behind the common elements. And what about Descartes? I mean, of course they hadn't read Pascal. They didn't know, I suppose, about Pascal. Do we have any evidence about the relations to what was happening in France or in Holland? I know Spinoza was notorious, but by at that time, during their lives, I mean, they couldn't know much, I mean, or anything about Spinoza himself, about the historical Spinoza, I mean, but they definitely knew Descartes, as you said. They knew Cartesian philosophy. And what exactly do they say about Descartes' system? Do they take a stand on Descartes' system as a whole? Because there is a coherent view, despite the difficulties, a kind of dualism, a kind of substance dualism, and then there is the problem of the body soul, the mind body problem as it appears in Descartes, which is actually the poisoned legacy, if you like, in the philosophy of mind that everybody, finds terrible. I mean, in the 20th century, Descartes is the bad guy because one of the many bad things he just gave us, I mean, we have inherited from him, is this dualism. Did they express themselves about such difficulties? Did they show any critical attitude? I mean, as philosophers, I mean, did they want to criticize people like Descartes particularly at all, or did they do all these things indirectly and through the passages that we know? And to close this, because I mean I could go on and on, the final thing which I find very, very fascinating is your suggestion that we look at them, I mean, today, because they offer us some kind of third way or some kind of solution, if you like, to these extremes of fideism and rationalism. Now, I mean, you're talking about epistemology mostly, but what about the metaphysics? Did they have a coherent metaphysics? I mean, because I got the impression that there was no real coherence. I mean, just if we take each one of them. I mean, let alone the whole bunch, the whole group. But I've been wondering who, if we wanted to read them, I mean, who would you regard as the most coherent, or the thinker who had worked harder on providing a kind of unified outlook? I mean, metaphysics, epistemology, religion, because I mean, frankly, I mean, there are many beautiful passages which you read, and I would like to go back and read them. But what if we want to make something out of the whole? And maybe this explains why, I mean, why some people scorned them, other people thought they were latitudinarians, or they were giving ideas to the atheists, or moving in, vacillating, or not clear on many matters of faith and philosophy for them. So I've asked a lot of questions, and I hope they made sense. I hope I was coherent in my questions.
Very much so. Now, if I may start with, as it were, your last question, and try to answer that as adequately as I can, and then come back to your earlier questions, particularly about Spinoza and in the interpretation of Spinoza. So I'll say, first of all, that the term Cartesianism was actually coined by Henry Moore. So in fact, Cartesianism predates le Cartesianisme, because it comes out of Enricus Morus writing to Descartes, and there's a very interesting exchange of letters between the young Henry Moore and Descartes. So in fact, for this reason, Moore was one of the most famous English philosophers on the continent through this exchange with Descartes. So this is an extremely important phase in British philosophy, and in fact, many of the terms that we use in Anglophone philosophy are derived from the Cambridge Platonists. I mean, not just Cartesianism, but self-consciousness, theism. So a lot of because of course this is still a liminal period where in the universities Latin is the language, is the lingua franca, and so they are in many ways the philosophers who are coining terminology. The philosophy of religion, for example, comes from Cudworth, another example. So they were they're philosophers. They're engaging directly with Descartes. They're not, as far as they're not aware of Pascal, but they are aware of Spinoza, by the way. Certainly aware of what Cudworth calls a theological tractate, and quite possibly elements of the ethics, because of course there were very close links between England and the Netherlands at that time. So figures like Limburg and others of the moderates in Holland were in very close connection with Locke and other English philosophers. So it may well be that there was a version of the ethics that was being circulated. So, just by the way, now they do engage with Descartes' metaphysics, and they are, as I say, a mixture of positive and critical.
Okay.
And there are two aspects of Descartes' philosophy that they find particularly disagreeable. So one is his theological voluntarism, right? Okay. So the doctrine in Descartes that God could make 2 and 2 equal 5, right? Now they think that's absolutely ridiculous, and so they think that in that sense, they're essentialists rather than voluntarists. The other aspect that they disagree with Descartes is over the notion of nature. So even though they accept the new Galilean Cartesian world, they think that it has to be modified. It has to be supplemented by what they call plastic nature, or the hierarchic principle. So now, basically, this is a version of the anima mundi. Now, this was discussed by Pierre Bayle and Leclerc, and became an important discussion in the Encyclopédie, and also, I think, had an influence on Romanticism, because anyway, it's a complicated story, but so it was the question of essentially the nature of God and the limits of mechanism, really. So they're accepting mechanism, but they think that the radically mechanistic vision of nature in Descartes is highly problematic. Now, this leads to some very interesting aspects. So one of these is Cudworth on consciousness. So Cudworth likes to take the example of the musician. So he says, look, if you consider a musician, it's not at all clear that the musician is conscious of playing the notes. In fact, the better the musician is, the less conscious he is. So now what's happening here is that Cudworth is drawing on a Platonian notion of levels of the self. And of course, that's linked to this notion of the anima mundi, which is used in maybe an inadequate, ultimately, way, but in a very sophisticated philosophical way, to try to show the problems with the Cartesian radical disjunction between conscious intellect and a mechanistic nature. Anyway, and now in terms of their works, Cudworth wrote a book called The True Intellectual System of the Universe. So he was very conscious that he wanted to produce a system of philosophy, and that work was translated into Latin by the great German humanist Lawrence von Mosheim in 1733, and there was another edition of that, which then became a textbook in Germany, among other places. And I'll give you just one instance of its influence. The battle cry of the Spinoza controversy in Germany in the 1780s is Hen Kai Pan. And the Hen Kai Pan was taken out of the Mosheim translation of Cudworth's True Intellectual System of the Universe. So, and in fact, when you look at the letters, the Spinoza Briefe, you see that that Lessing refers to a so-called Heinrich More, and Heinrich More, of course, is Henry More. I mean, so the legacy of these figures, More wrote a handbook of metaphysics, an Enchiridion, which was certainly a systematic metaphysical system. So whether the success or otherwise of these metaphysical systems is another matter, but they were out and out metaphysicians who wanted to produce systems of philosophy. Now, and in fact, in many ways, I think that if one part of my justification for these figures is that they stress the ineluctability of metaphysics. Of course, after the 20th century, where I suppose the dominant philosophical strands, both continental and Anglophone, have been to decry metaphysics or to claim that metaphysics is an impossible task, I think the Cambridge Platonists would be saying that metaphysics, when we're doing philosophy, is ineluctable. We can't do philosophy without raising these metaphysical questions. And just finally, I know I've been answering your questions in a rather long-winded way, but I would like to just say, well, yes, in some respects, I understand your problems with my interpretation of Spinoza. I can only say that in a sense, I was producing or trying to present paradigms, really. And it seems to me that what Spinoza presents is a certain sort of religious paradigm. And you can find it being attractive to figures like Einstein, right? God does not play dice. Yeah? But but it's a very different conception of spirituality, a very different conception of the relationship between God and world than you would find in the theistic tradition.
Yes.
Right? So that's now finally just on the question of the philosophy as a way of life. John Smith actually says that I would rather call it a divine life than a divine science. So in a sense, these figures are also drawing upon that sense of antique philosophy as providing some sort of spiritual guidance. So they'd agree entirely with Spinoza that metaphysics and ethics are intimately linked. They would just disagree with certain aspects of Spinoza's metaphysics.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, actually, when you said Einstein, I had in mind also Ronald Dworkin's Religion Without God, where he draws a parallel between his view and Spinoza's view.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, apologies for mispronouncing latitudinarian. Okay, I'm sorry that this is a long-winded word. So now the floor is open for questions, and we can have a look at people in the audience may want to ask. So the question is, why does Russell, in his introduction to mathematical philosophy, points out that human powers are finite, but that's incomplete. That's an incomplete sentence. I don't know, Douglas, can you see that?
I could say something about that. I could say, well, you mentioned David Hume, and I would say that Russell is basically in the Humean.
Yes, I fully agree. I fully agree.
So,
yes.
So it's and again, the big difference in the I mean, take for example the difference between Spinoza and Hume on miracles, right? So they're the two most important critiques of miracles in the Enlightenment. Spinoza, but they're completely different. Spinoza's critique of miracles is that they cannot happen by definition, right? So the idea of a miracle is incompatible with the idea of God, because of course everything naturally, necessarily flows from the divine substance. Hume's attitude is basically one based on skepticism, that we can never trust the testimony with sufficient warrant that it would override our confidence that a law had been broken. So that in a way the Humean critique is based on our limitations. We always have to assume human frailty, human limitations, and we always have to assume that it's more likely that witnesses of a miracle are lying or fabricating or are simply ignorant than we can be confident that the law has been broken. So they're radically different approaches. And Russell is in that Humean tradition, which is essentially grounded in a sense of human cognitive limitations.
Right. So Russell is emphasizing the cognitive limitations. Yeah. So now there is a question by Ms. Nafsika Thanasoulis. Thank you for this wonderful talk. If you'll permit a question by a non-specialist, is there a connection between the Neoplatonic law of love and the ancient Greek conceptions of love? Ancient Greek, presumably before Neoplatonism, specifically perhaps the love felt between two virtuous friends based on their mutual understanding of the noble and the good.
Yes, of course. Well, you could say that in some respects, the Neoplatonism is a philosophy of love, and that both the Symposium and the Phaedrus play an extremely important role for the Platonists in their conception of the relationship of the self to the world and to the divine. And given that the Cambridge Platonists were humanists, they were recipients of this Platonic notion of eros, as well as a more Christian notion of agape.
Right. What about the Cambridge Platonists on this? I mean, what would you say?
That's what I meant. Yes, I mean that they meant that they in fact, this is one of the critiques of the Augustinian tradition. So they think that the Augustinian notion of God, particularly the later Augustine, the doctrine of double predestination, and the Jansenist conception of Augustine, and that, of course, of the Puritan divines in Cambridge at the time, was basically a tyrannical figure.
Mm-hmm.
And that they thought that this was, frankly, not a God worth worshipping. And so the idea that in the gospel that God is love is, of course, that's theos agapeistin. It is linked to the Platonic notion of the eros.
Mm-hmm. And since you said that they were very much against the Calvinist conception of predestination, what did they think about freedom? Were they embracing a kind of compatibilist view, or a stronger kind of more libertarian conception of?
Well, that's a really tricky question, and I'm afraid I don't want to delay us too long, but I'd say it's a mixture of a libertarian element and a version of compatibilism.
Okay.
But they're very influenced by Origen in this respect.
Okay. Ms. Athanasios, she had Aristotle in mind, which would fit in with Augustine.
Yeah.
Okay. No other questions? I mean, please feel. Now there is another question here. The question I would like to ask is very basic. Why do we need a third road between fideism and rationalism? Does this need emerge from a different experience of spirituality nowadays, or from a lack thereof? Or is it essentially a matter of faith? So why do we need, I mean, what would you say about the need to find a third way between fideism and rationalism?
Well, I think this comes out of the status of the hard sciences or the natural sciences in the modern world, and the dominant view, philosophical position in the sort of Anglo-American world, I would say, is a version of naturalism. Mm-hmm. That knowledge is essentially the knowledge that we can discover through the laboratories and through scientific method. And what we might think of as knowledge, which is not the result of the scientific methods, is in fact grounded in convention or a human projection onto the world, which may be very important for solving coordination problems or for having a consoling view of life, but is not ultimately true. Now, obviously, one response to this question about the status of science and the role of science in the modern world is to reject the key epistemological significance of science. I think that would be the more Pascalian view, and in a way to have a sort of two truths approach, right? So we've got scientific truth, and then we've got the truth of the l'esprit de géométrie, or the truth of the heart, or whatever. But that can often lead to a kind of schizophrenia that one believes one day in the scientific verities, and the next day you're believing in a whole another domain of incompatible truths, as in inverted commas. Of course, the other alternative is to simply go with the naturalistic paradigm, but that generates all kinds of problems. I mean, there are many deep difficulties, not least with consciousness. I mean, one of the interesting developments in modern philosophy has been the development of panpsychism. So, and that's emerged out of the failures of reductionistic attempts to account for consciousness. And in many ways, this goes back to exactly the same issues that you find Cudworth and More raising against Hobbes, who is a straightforward reductionist,
Sure.
and saying, yeah, well, of course, Descartes is right to insist upon the significance of consciousness, but the way that he relates consciousness to the material world is inadequate. So that's why I think that finding a middle way which avoids, on the one hand, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia, on one, but also avoids a reductionism that is itself problematic, is important philosophically, and I would say for the spiritual life.
Yeah, so you would they would support some view of re-enchanted naturalism or enchanted naturalism, you might say. I mean, this is a kind of fashionable term, I mean, nowadays because of certain models. But since you mentioned Hobbes, I mean, that would be, I mean, I would go for a contrast between Pascal and Hobbes and the French materialists rather. Okay, I mean, Spinoza is a peculiar case, that just because he has this very strange paradoxical kind of religiosity from, I mean, sub specie aeterni, a sense of awe, or which is almost religious, if not, you know, religious in what we understand as, you know, traditional religious.
Yeah.
That's why, you know, this is talk about pantheism and how to interpret it, and whether maybe you could bring in panentheism. I mean, you know, there's this reading of Spinoza as a panentheist. Maybe it's wrong, but it's there. It's a possibility.
Oh, indeed. In fact, of course, for the Romantics, you've got Novalis, who talks about Spinoza as the gottbetrunkene Mensch. You know, he's the god, the divinely drunken man. Of course, another Platonic image, of course. That,
right. Any other? I mean, I suppose, I mean, people haven't read much. I mean, something should be done, you know, about, maybe you'll reintroduce them to a wider kind of public. I mean, so that they, you know, maybe there should be some selection of, they're very attractive texts, the ones you chose. I mean, the musical soul and these ideas about, you know, a pagan being better than a Christian who is a fanatic, and so these are very, very interesting ideas.
No, and in fact, I'm involved in, I had been involved in a long-standing editorial project with my colleague Christian Hengstemann from the University of Wuppertal, and we are working on an edition of Henry More's Latin works, because these were the works that were particularly significant on the continent, and involve his critiques of Descartes, Jakob Böhmer, who's of course a very significant figure in the 18th century, and indeed Spinoza. We are also working on this is again together with Christian. We're working on and Marilyn Lewis on a selection of their philosophical texts and for Routledge. So this will be a guide to the Cambridge Platonists, so that people whose primary interest is in philosophy can have access to some of these texts in a readily accessible form. There is also an online resource that I was directing, which you can find under the Cambridge Platonists .com. It'll take you to the Cambridge to a Cambridge online site where you can see a lot of the texts in a readily accessible form.
Yeah. What about theologians? I mean, you've been talking about philosophy of religion, but what is the reception of the Cambridge Platonists in the theological tradition itself? I mean, in a more narrow sense, have they been read and studied, taken seriously, or?
Oh yes, yes, and they had a considerable influence, not just in Britain, but also in America. So sometimes in a critical way. So a figure like Emerson is deeply influenced by the Cambridge Platonists, and in fact refers to them quite explicitly. So I think you'll find on the paradigmatic text of Emerson called Nature that he starts off with a citation from Henry Moore. Okay. So, and in theology, they have been contributing to, I say, a sort of broadly liberal theological tradition, and within the English-speaking world.
And the mystical strands, have they been, you know?
Exactly. So again, and in many, you might say that, of course, because of their humanism, that they almost see by Byzantine. So there are all kinds of parallels with Palamas or with the Gregory of Nyssa. So they, in many ways, you could say that they're more Greek than Latin. It's basically the metaphysics of the self then is fused with a theology of theosis. So so it's and again, this fits in with the lack of interest in sort of rather constituent Western theological themes like hell and damnation, and more with deification and freedom. So you could say that they represent yes, even theologically, a more Greek perspective.
Right. And yeah, and what you said also in connection with the philosophy as a way of life tradition. I mean, then there may be a connection also with virtue ethical considerations. I don't know if they have writings on the virtues and theological or other. Have they written on virtues at all? Or?
Well, again they're Neoplatonic in that sense, so that in a sense the civic virtues are subordinated to the as it were to the whole process of the aphiresis and transformation into the object of aspiration. So they tend to have a fusion of metaphysics and ethics, in which Henry Moore says famously, "If thou bees it, thou sees it."
Right.
So,
but there is no kind of systematic, kind of systematic view which takes you gradually and systematically from epistemology, metaphysics to ethics in a kind of traditional way. It's more, it's looser. The connections are looser.
Yes. I mean, I mean, part of this is that the dominant philosophy in Cambridge in the 17th century was late scholastic Aristotelianism.
Okay.
So they and they are quite consciously presenting this, what they call sort of fusion of Platonism and Cartesianism, as an alternative to the textbooks of the day, right, which are these late scholastic sort of neo-Aristotelian works.
And in that respect, they are modern, because this is a common theme in Descartes, and everyone who was going against the scholastic,
yes, exactly.
Tradition. Yes. Okay. So, if there is no other question, then perhaps maybe we can close here, and I can ask Theoni to take the floor. I would like to thank you once more for this wonderful talk and for the answers to all these questions. And I mean, I feel enlightened about not only about the Cambridge Platonists, but all these issues. And I'm definitely going to try and read more of these texts. So thank you so much. So Theoni, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Stelios. Professor Hedley, thank you so much, along with our discussant and the participants with their questions. You have co-created an intellectually inspiring evening for all. Thank you all for your participation. Until next time, enjoy a pleasant evening. Goodbye.